Chris slipped his hand up her shirt, certain she would taste of them too. He heard Emily make a noise at the back of her throat, and he took it to mean that she liked this as much as he did. He slid his hand down the front of her jeans, slipping beneath the waistband of her panties. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of our book club series. So, today we're gonna do, I think it's reading 11. I'm pretty sure it's reading 11. And we are starting on page, oh that's right, last time my camera died. So we didn't actually finish at like a certain spot. Okay, I remember now. Let's see. We ended, I really hope you guys can see me good. So I'm gonna start a little bit before we ended. I'm on page 144 at the very bottom of 144. Well, the middle bottom. Okay. Well, if they do, so what? They're going to have sex one day anyway. Yes, Melanie said slowly, but it doesn't have to be at 15. 16. Wrong. Chris is 16. Emily is 15. A mature 15. A female 15. Gus set down her lemonade. What does that have to do with it? Everything, Melanie shook her head. You wait till it's Kate's turn. I'll assume, as I do now with Chris, that Kate is old enough and bright enough to be making the right decisions. No, you won't. You'll want to keep her your little girl for as long as you can. Gus laughed. Emily's always going to be your little girl, she said. Melanie turned in her chair. Think of yourself, after your first time, she urged. Emily is mine now, but afterward, well, she'll belong to Chris. Gus was silent for a moment. You're wrong, she said softly. Even now, Emily belongs to Chris. The previous spring, Chris had begun working at Shady Acres, a small playground that was neither shady nor on a full acre. It sported an octopus-like plastic climbing structure, a sandbox, and an antique carousel, which could be ridden for 25 cents. Chris ran the carousel. It was mindless, dizzying work, collecting the quarters, settling the kids on the horses, checking safety belts, pushing the button that activated the motor, then waiting for the calliope tape to finish one entire round of song before shutting the power and letting the carousel spin slowly to a stop. He liked the candied smell of the toddlers he'd hefted into the saddles. He liked swinging up on a support pole as the carousel slowed, to help the children unlatch their belts and slide down. He liked taking a damp cloth at the end of the day to wipe down the manes of the horses and to stare into their frozen, rolling eyes. This year, the owners had given him his own key. It was Friday and exceptionally warm for a night in April. Chris and Emily had gone to see a movie, but it was early and Chris wasn't ready to go home. Driving aimlessly, he wound up in the parking lot of the playground. Hey, Emily said, her face lighting up. Let's go on the swings. She got out of the car and raced across the mud. By the time Chris made his way there, she was already in the air, her face tipped up to the night sky. He walked in the other direction, hearing Em call out, then used his carousel key to open the control panel. In the moonlight, the horses began to run. Delighted, Emily got off her swing and came closer. When did they give you a key? She asked. Chris shrugged. Last weekend. Oh, it's wonderful. Can I get on? He grabbed her around the waist and swung her up by the white horse she loved best. Be my guest, he said. Emily climbed onto the wooden horse and, after the carousel made one full revolution, held out her hand to Chris. You come too, she urged. He chose the horse beside hers, and as soon as he was seated, he realized his mistake. When Emily was up, he was down, and vice versa. He leaned into her as their horses came level and kissed her cheek. Emily laughed, then leaned back to kiss him. He slid off his horse and held out his arms for Emily. And then they were lying on the thick painted planks beneath the horses, the churning wooden hooves just clearing their arms and legs. Emily leaned back, her eyes closed, her mind full of the music. Chris slipped his hand up her shirt. Her bra in the front, and oh God, she felt good. Soft and full, all at the same time. She smelled of peaches. Chris leaned his head toward the curve of her neck and licked her, certain she would taste of them too. He heard Emily make a noise at the back of her throat, and he took it to mean that she liked this as much as he did. He slid his hand down the front of her jeans, slipping beneath the waistband of her panties as well, so that his fingers brushed against silky hair. Holding his breath, he inched his fingers downward. "Stop," she whimpered. "Chris, stop." When he didn't, she took her fist and clubbed him in the ear. He reared back, his head ringing like a son of a bitch. But before he could yell at him, he saw the white oval of her face shake in denial. Then she was standing. She leaped off the moving carousel, falling once before she gained her footing, leaving Chris spinning in circles. In the movies, when things like that happened, the heroine somehow found her way home. But all Emily could think was that in real life, the ultimate indignity was having to shove your boyfriend away, then still need him to drive you home. She felt Chris slide into the seat beside her and kept her face averted until the overhead light in the Jeep went off. But she did not have to look to know that his jaw would be tight, his lips pressed into a line. For a moment she wanted to mold herself against him in hopes that that would make him soften. She remembered being a toddler, screaming to her mother that she wanted to be put down, but clinging all the harder. "Maybe," she whispered, "we shouldn't see each other for a while." Chris put the car into drive and nodded. Next section. Everything about Donna DeFelice was legendary. From her spun sugar hair to her grapefruit-sized breasts to her cheerleader split, the fastest anyone could ever remember seeing at the high school. For 2 years, she had made it clear to Chris that if she was willing, For 2 years, she had made it clear to Chris that if he was willing, she was available. And finally, pushed over the edge by Emily, he decided to reciprocate. He could not see in the Jeep, and the moisture that had fogged the insides of the window seeped through the shoulder of his shirt when he brushed up against it. Beneath him, Donna arrived in the back seat. Chris hadn't even taken her out to dinner. She'd put her hand on his leg during the drive to the restaurant and asked what he was really hungry for. And now she was remarkably, totally naked, and her hand was wrapped around him. And Chris didn't think she even realized he'd never done this before. In the thin light from the dashboard, Donna's chest was tinted a luminous green, but magnificent for all that. Her eyes were slitted and her mouth rounded on his own name. The only thing wrong with her was that she wasn't M. "Oh God," Donna moaned. "Give it to me now." She pulled him onto her. One thrust, he thought, and I'm going to lose it. But to his surprise, he wasn't nearly as carried away as he'd expected to be. He felt almost as if he was watching himself from a corner of the car, seeing Donna buck beneath him like an animal he couldn't put a name to. When it was over, she pushed him off her and wriggled into her underwear. Then she curled up under his arm, feeling all wrong there. "That was something," she breathed, "wasn't it?" "Something," Chris agreed. He stared out the windshield, wondering how he could have been stupid enough to think that it was sex he had wanted all along, when in fact, he had only wanted Emily. Next section. All day long, Emily had hidden in school corridors and ducked into bathrooms so that no one would see her cry. Everywhere she went, though she heard people talking about the way Chris Hart had been walking with his arm around Donna Felice. At sixth period, when Emily had walked toward the trig class she had with Chris and found him leaning over Donna on a bank of lockers just outside the door, she finally broke down. She asked Mrs. McCarthy for a pass to the nurse and had no problem getting the woman to believe she was ill. It wasn't her throat and it wasn't a fever, but it hurt all the same to be heartbroken. When her mother came to pick her up, Emily slouched down in the passenger seat and turned her head away. Then she went up to her room and crawled under the covers. She stayed there until it was dark. Chris's Jeep left at 6:15. Emily watched the headlights disappear down Wood Hollow Road until she could not see them anymore. She imagined where Chris would be taking Donna Felice on a Friday night. She did not have to imagine what they would be doing. Disgusted with herself, she sat down at her desk and tried to concentrate on the English paper she had to write by Monday. But she only got as far as sliding the paperclip from the pages she'd drafted. She stared down at the words, reading none of them, and bent the clip back and forth. letting friction work up a heat until it broke apart. At 11, when Chris was still not home, Emily's mother knocked on the door and let herself in. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, sitting down beside Emily on the bed. Emily turned toward the wall. "Not good," she said thickly. "We can go to the doctor in the morning," Melanie offered. "No, it's not that. I'm all right. I just want to stay up here for a while." "And does this have to do with Chris?" Amazed, Emily whipped around to face her mother. "Who told you?" Melanie laughed. "It doesn't take a graduate degree to figure out that you two haven't called each other in a week." Emily ran her hand through her hair. "We had a fight," she admitted. "And?" "And what?" She certainly wasn't going to tell her mother what they'd been fighting about. "And I think I made him mad enough for him to stay away." She took a deep breath. "Mom," she said, "what do I do to bring him back?" Melanie looked stunned. "You don't have to do anything. He'll come around." "How do you know that?" "Because you are two halves of a whole," Melanie said, then kissed her daughter's forehead and left the room. Emily glanced down at a sharp pain in her forearm to find that she was still holding the jagged edge of the paperclip. Curiously, she drew it over her skin, scratching the surface. The red line grew brighter when she traced a second time, and a third. She dug deeper and deeper until she was bleeding, until Chris's initials were carved hard enough into her arm to leave a scar. Next section. This is getting dark quickly. Chris's Jeep got home shortly after one in the morning. Emily watched him from her bedroom window. He turned on light after light as he worked his way through the kitchen and up the stairs. By the time he entered his own room and started to get ready for bed, Emily had thrown a sweatshirt over her nightgown and stuffed her bare feet into sneakers. The ground, considerably softened by the recent weather, was damp and soft, and pine needles that had been sleeping beneath snow squelched under her feet. Chris's window was directly over the kitchen. It had been years since she'd done it, but Emily picked up a thin twig and tossed it at the panes of glass. It landed with a light snap and bounced back toward her. She picked it up from between her feet and threw it again. This time, a table lamp flared on, and Chris's face appeared at the window. Seeing Emily, he opened the sash and stuck his head out. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Stay there." Seconds later, he eased open the kitchen door. "What?" he demanded. There was much she had imagined in this reunion, but anger had never been a part of it. Remorse, maybe? Joy? Acceptance? Certainly not the look that was on Chris's face right now. "I came to ask," she said, her voice trembling, "if you had a nice time on your date." Chris swore and rubbed a hand down his face. "I don't need this. I can't do this right now." He turned on his heel and started back into the house. "Wait!" Emily cried. Her words were thick with tears, but she lifted her chin and crossed her arms tight over her chest to keep from shaking. I have this problem. I broke up with my boyfriend, you see, and I'm pretty upset about it, so I wanted to talk to my best friend." She swallowed and looked at the black ground. "The thing is, they are both you." "Emily," Chris whispered and pulled her close. She tried not to think of the unfamiliar scent of him, something perfumed mixed with something else lush and ripe. Instead, Emily concentrated on the way it felt to be next to Chris again, two halves of a whole. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids. She buried her face against his shirt. "I can't stand it," she said, and she was not certain what she was talking about. Suddenly, Chris grasped her wrist. "Jesus," he said, "you're bleeding." "I know, I cut myself." "On what?" Emily shook her head. "It's nothing," she said, but she let Chris lead her into the kitchen and sit her down while he retrieved a Band-Aid. If he noticed that his own initials were on her arm, he was wise enough to keep silent. She closed her eyes while he touched her with all the care in the world, and she started to heal. December 1997. So we're back to now. So I guess that we were a year before, and now we're back to now. Chris had 35 square feet to himself. His cell was 35 square feet to himself. That's big. That's a lot. His cell was painted 35. I'm just double checking. Chris had 35 square feet to himself. That's what it says. Okay. His cell was painted a strange shade of gray that sucked up all the light. The bottom bunk had a pillow and plastic mattress, and the blanket he'd been given. Beside it was a toilet and sink. His cell was sandwiched between two others, like a tight row of teeth. When the barred doors of the cell were open most of the day, except for mealtimes, Chris could stand on the narrow walk that ran the length of the pod. At one end was a shower and a phone, where he could collect calls. At the other end was a television, strategically placed on the free side of the bars. Chris learned a great deal his first day, without ever asking for information. He discovered that from the moment you entered jail, your slate was wiped clean. Where you wound up, from the security level to the position of your bunk, was not determined by your charged offense or behavior prior to incarceration, but by the way you acted once you got there. The good news was that the classification board met every Tuesday, and you could petition for a change of locale. The bad news was that today was Thursday. Chris decided that he would simply go for a week without speaking to anyone. Then, next Tuesday, he'd surely be moved out of the maximum security section into medium security. He'd heard that upstairs the walls were yellow. He'd just finished a meal, served in his locked cell on an insulated plastic tray, when two inmates came to the door. "Hey," one said, the man he'd spoken to yesterday, "what's your name?" "Chris," he said. "You?" "Hector, and that's Damon." The unfamiliar man with long, greasy hair nodded at Chris. "You never did tell me what you're in here for," Hector said. "They think I murdered my girlfriend," Chris muttered. Hector and Damon exchanged a look. "No shit," Damon said. "I had you pegged for a narc." Hector scratched his back against the bars. He was wearing boxer shorts and a t-shirt with rubber thongs. Okay, I guess that means like flip-flops. I guess. "What did you use?" Chris stared at him blankly. "Knife, gun, you know." Chris tried to push past them. "I don't want to talk about it," he said. He broad-shouldered Damon, only to feel the larger man's hand on his shoulder. He glanced down to find a makeshift knife in Hector's hand, a razor blade pressed against Chris's ribs. "Maybe I do," Hector said. "Okay, I don't want to talk about it. Maybe I do," Hector said. Chris swallowed and backed off. Hector slipped the knife inside his shirt. "Look," Chris said carefully, "why don't we try acting rationally?" "Rationally," Damon said. "There's a $5 word." Hector snorted. "You sound like a fancy-ass college boy," he said. "You from the college?" I'm in high school," Chris said. At that, Hector crowed. "Actually, college boy, you're in jail." He wrapped his hand against the bars. "Hey," he yelled out. "We got us a genius down here." He cocked one foot up against the lower bunk. "Tell me this, college boy. If you're so smart, how come you got caught?" Chris was saved from answering by an officer walking down the length of the barred catwalk. "Anyone want to go to the exercise room?" He stood up. Hector and Damon also started toward the door at the end of the pod. Damon turned around and whispered, "We're not done, man." They filed through a corridor dotted with cameras. A few men called out to each other. This was the only time each day they had contact. As they went around the corner, Chris noticed Damon slipping behind, person by person, until he could jab a well-aimed elbow into the back of another inmate at a certain turn of the hall. It was, Chris realized, the blind spot between two cameras. Just before the exercise room were two isolation cells. You could wind up in isolation two ways: by force, because you were acting out, or by request, because you were scared of the other inmates. Only one was occupied now. The prisoners started to holler, pounding on the door. One even leaning down to spit in the slotted opening. The exercise room was small and sparsely furnished. With only a handful of equipment, but it filled like everything else in the jail. By prearrangement. There was no waiting and no fight, as two large black men claimed the stationary bicycles. As Hector and Damon picked up the table tennis paddles, as a tall guy with a swastika tattoo on his cheek began to bench press. There was a pecking order, Chris realized, that he was not privy to. But then again, why should he be? He did not fit in. Frowning, he walked out to the exercise courtyard, a muddy square heavily ringed with barbed wire. Men were talking in small groups, gesturing with their hands. Others moved aimlessly, counterclockwise. Chris found someone leaning against the chain-link fence, staring at the mountains in the distance. That guy in the isolation room, he said without preamble. What did he do? The man shrugged. Shook his baby to death. Frigging animal. Chris looked over the barbed wire and thought of honor among thieves. He called home collect. Chris? Mom? He said just that word over and over, with his head leaning against the blue payphone. Oh, honey, I tried to come see you. Did they tell you? Chris closed his eyes. No, he said tightly. Well, I did. But they said visiting hours aren't until Saturday, so I'll be there first thing. She took a deep breath. This is a horrible mistake, you know. Jordan's already got the prosecution files. He's going to find a way to get you out as quickly as possible. When is he coming to see me? I'll call him and ask, his mother said. Are you eating all right? Can I bring you anything? He thought about that, unsure what was allowed in. Money, he said. Hang on, Chris. Your father wants to talk to you. I know. I've got to go. Someone needs the phone. He lied. Oh, all right. He lied. Someone needs the phone. He doesn't want to talk to his dad. What else is new? Oh, all right. You call here whenever you want. Do you understand? We don't care about your reversing the charges. Okay, Mom. Suddenly there was a teeny, recorded voice. This call, it announced, is being made from the county correctional facility. Both Chris and his mother were silent for a moment. I love you, sweetheart, Gus finally said. Chris swallowed and slipped the receiver back into the cradle. He stayed there for a moment, leaning his head against the payphone until he felt the hard press of a body behind him. Damon was rubbing his spine, his breath on Chris's neck. You miss your mama, Professor? You miss your mama, Professor? He pushed his lips forward, his groin coming in contact with Chris's behind. Wasn't this what he had been expecting? Wasn't this what he had been afraid of? Chris whirled around, catching the bigger man by surprise. Get away from me, he said, his eyes glittering, and he backed up into his cell. Even with the covers over his head, he heard Damon laughing. Chris thanked God for his lack of a cellmate. He lived in fear of suddenly having Damon thrown into his bunk, because although the officers were fairly good about keeping control during the day, who knew what they bothered to hear at night? He picked up the storylines on Days of Our Lives. He went to an AA meeting on Wednesday night just to get out of the pod. He filled out a commissary order, which reminded him of the room service ice breakfast sheet at the hotel in Canada his family had visited last summer. An 8-ounce jar of coffee was $5.25. A Three Musketeers bar was 60 cents. Thongs were $2. I'm assuming they mean flip-flops. That has to mean flip-flops. His items were delivered to him that afternoon by an officer, and the total amount was deducted from his prison account. He slept a lot, pretending even when he wasn't tired so that people would leave him alone. And when clusters of men gathered in the exercise yard, Chris was always standing by himself. A long time ago, Jordan had stopped believing the truth. There was no truth, at least not in his profession. There were versions, and a trial was not based on truth anyway, but on what police had and how you could respond to it. A good criminal defense lawyer did not think about the truth and focused instead on what a jury was going to hear. Years earlier, Jordan had stopped asking his clients for the real story. Now he went in with a blank face and simply said, "What happened?" He was standing at the control area of the maximum security unit, waiting for the officer in charge to slide the clipboard out so that he could sign in as a visitor. For his first post-arrangement interview with Chris, he brought along Selena Damascus, a 6'1", black female private investigator who seemed better suited to fashion runways than doing Jordan's legwork, but who had been doing a damn good job all the same for several years. Where are they keeping him? Selena asked. Maximum, Jordan answered. He's only been here 2 days. A heavy barred door closed somewhere upstairs, and a uniformed prison officer came down. Hey, Bill, the officer at the control station said. Tell Hart his lawyer's here. Another gated door snapped open. No matter how many times Jordan heard it, he just couldn't get used to the sound, which was rather like a gunshot, and he walked in, getting only the slightest glimpse of the inmates before he turned left toward the conference room used for client visitation. Selena moved behind him, a shadow, and took a seat beside him at the conference table. She tipped her chair back and stared at the ceiling. Damn ugly jail, she said. I think that every time I'm here. Jordan agreed. Jordan agreed. The decor certainly isn't the reason it's so popular. The door swung open and Chris entered the room, his eyes moving from Jordan to Selena. Chris, Jordan said, standing up, this is Selena Damascus. She's a private investigator who will be helping with your case. Look, Chris said without preamble, I have to get out of here. Jordan took out a stack of papers from his briefcase. In the best case scenario, Chris, that's exactly what's going to happen. No, you don't understand. I need to get out of here now. Something in the boy's tone made Jordan look up. Gone was the frightened boy who had been on the verge of tears in the Bainbridge police lockup, and in its place was someone harder, stronger, and capable of hiding his terrors. What exactly is the problem? At that, Chris exploded. What's the problem? What's the problem? I'm sitting on my ass in a jail cell, that's all. I'm supposed to graduate this year. I'm supposed to go to college, but instead I'm locked in a cage with a bunch of criminals. Jordan did not blink an eye. It's unfortunate that the judge didn't grant you bail, and you're right. It means you're stuck in jail until the trial, which could be 6 to 9 months. But it's not wasted time. Every minute you're sitting in that jail, I'm coming up with a stronger case to get you free. He leaned forward, hardened his voice. Let's get something straight, Jordan said. I'm not the enemy here. I'm not the reason you wound up in jail. I'm the lawyer, and you are the client, period. And if you've been indicted on a charge of first-degree murder, which carries a life sentence and you've been indicted on a charge of first-degree murder, which carries a life sentence of imprisonment. What that means, Chris, is that your life is literally in my hands. Whether you spend it in prison or at Harvard comes down to whether or not I can get you off. He stood up and walked behind Selena. And that depends on the amount of cooperation I get from you. Whatever you tell me and Selena does not leave this room. I'm in control of what you say and who you say it to. And I need to know what I need to know when I need to know it. Understood? Understood, Chris said, meeting his gaze. All right, let me explain where we stand. I'm going to make a lot of the decisions in this case after I consult with you, but there are 3 things that only you can decide. The first is whether or not to accept a plea bargain or go to trial. The second is, if you go to trial, whether you want that trial held in front of a judge only or a jury as well. Finally, if there is a trial, whether or not you want to take the stand. I'll give you as much information as possible to make informed decisions, but you'll have to make your choices as we prepare. You following me? Chris nodded. Okay, next. I'm going to be getting the discovery from the Attorney General's office fairly soon. After I do, I'll come back here and we'll review it together in detail. What's the discovery? I don't know. Does anybody know what the discovery means? Is that a legal term, or is it just like something old? Is it just an old term? Okay, where did we go? We got lost. Okay, next I'm going to be getting the discovery from the Attorney General's office fairly soon. After I do, I'll come back here and we'll review it together in detail. Okay, when is that going to be? In about 2 weeks, Jordan said. Then in 5 weeks or so, there will be a preliminary pretrial conference. He raised his brows. Before we start, do you have any other questions? Yeah. Can I see Dr. Feinstein? Jordan narrows his eyes slightly. I don't think that's a good idea. Chris's mouth dropped open. He's a psychiatrist. He's also someone who could be subpoenaed. The doctor-patient confidentiality relationship isn't always inviolable, especially when you throw in a charge of murder. Having you speak to anyone about the crime could come back to haunt us. Chris snorted, like I've made so many friends here. Jordan pretended not to hear him. There are guys in here for drug cases up for 7-year sentences. But if they can get any information on you and plead it up, they will. The cops might even put a narc in with you for that very purpose. What if Dr. Feinstein and I don't talk about what happened? What are you going to talk about then? Stuff, Chris said softly. Jordan leaned against the table next to Chris. If you need someone to confide in, he said, that person will be me. He began walking back to his seat. Any other questions? Yeah, Chris said. Do you have any kids? Jordan stopped dead. Do I what? You heard me. I don't see why that has anything to do with your case. It doesn't, Chris admitted. It's just that if you're going to know me inside and out by the time this is all over, I thought I ought to know something about you. Jordan heard Selena snicker. I have a son, he said. He's 13. Now, if we're finished with the introductions, I want to get down to business. Today's agenda involves as much information as possible. We need you to sign release forms so that we can get your medical records. Are there any hospitalizations we should know about? Physical or mental disabilities that would make you incapable of physically pulling a trigger? The only time I've been hospitalized was after that night for my head, and I cut that when I passed out. For my head, and I cut that when I passed out. Chris bit his lip. I've been hunting since I was 8. Where did you get that gun? Where did you get the gun that night? Selena asked. It was my father's. It was in the gun cabinet with all the hunting rifles and shotguns. So you're accustomed to firearms? Sure, Chris said. Who loaded the revolver? I did. Before you left your house? No. Chris stared at his hands. Jordan raked his hand through his hair. Can you give me the names of people who would be able to describe your relationship with Emily? My parents, Chris said. Her parents. I guess just about anyone at school. Selena looked up from her notepad. What should I expect these people to tell us? Chris shrugged. That Emily and I were, together. Might these people have also noticed that Emily was blank? Rhymes with idle? Selena asked. I don't know, Chris said. She kept it pretty close to her chest. We'll also need to show a jury that you were planning to blank yourself that night. Unlive yourself that night. Any counselors you spoke to? Mental health people you'd seen? I wanted to talk to you about that, Chris said, licking his dry lips. There isn't anyone who's going to tell you I was planning on blanking myself. Maybe if you mentioned it in a journal, Selena suggested. A note you wrote to Emily? Chris shook his head. The thing is, I wasn't. He cleared his throat. Blank. I wasn't blank idle. Jordan briskly pushed the admission aside. We'll talk about that later, he said, silently groaning. It was better, in Jordan's opinion, not to know any more than you needed to know about a client's crime. That way, you could proceed with your defense without violating any ethics. But once a client told you his story, that was the story. And if he took the stand, he had to stick with it. Confused, Chris looked from Jordan to Selena. Wait, he said. Don't you want me to tell you what really happened? Jordan flipped his pad to a new blank page. Actually, he said, I don't. Let's see. I think we're going to finish there for now. We're on page 157 in the middle. I'm trying to make these videos a little bit shorter, just a little bit, so that I don't have to do a break in the middle of them. But let's see. Anyways, thank you guys for joining me for today's reading. And again, I hope that you guys are, why is this not focusing? Hello, focus, please. On me. Thank you. Okay, anyways, I'm just glad that you guys care about this and want to follow along with me. Yeah, anyway, so I hope that you guys are enjoying it as much as I am. I love doing this. I will probably do another one depending on the feedback that I get. So if you do like this, if you are following along, if you want me to do another one, like if this is something that you're into and you like want me to continue to do, please let me know, because I don't want to just keep doing it if nobody cares about it. You know what I mean? But from what I'm gathering, people are enjoying it and people are following along, but I need some more feedback. So if you guys just reach out to me on Instagram or wherever you know me from and let me know how you're liking it, if you do like it, if you want me to keep going. Yeah, and anyways, thanks so much for hanging out with me and reading with me today. I'll talk to you guys later and see you in the next video. Goodbye. I love you.
How y'all feel out there?
I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.